The United Nations envoy Hans Grunberg confirms that the war in Yemen must end. The United Kingdom calls on all Yemeni parties to start the political talks at once. A new study by the Global Initiative confirms that Iran is involved in smuggling arms to Houthis through Somalia. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swayna. The UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, called for an urgent end to fighting as humanitarian needs escalate. The UN Secretary General spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric said that Grunberg briefed the Security Council's closed meeting on his recent visit to Yemen and the region.
Turning to Yemen, Hans Grunberg, our special envoy, briefed the Security Council in closed consultations this morning on his recent work, including his travels in Yemen. He participated by video conference. Mr. Grunberg concluded yesterday a three-day visit to Taiz Governorate, where he held meetings in Taiz City, Turba, and Mocha, where he discussed with a wide range of stakeholders the urgent necessity for an end to the conflict. Mr. Grunberg underlined that in his meetings the need for a comprehensive solution and inclusive political dialogue, and called for all stakeholders to engage in constructive discussions on political, military, economic issues that concern everyone in Yemen.
The UN spokesperson added that the United Nations is concerned over fighting in Marib and referred that this could displace another 450,000 Yemeni people, calling at the same time to an immediate end to a nationwide ceasefire.
We're also deeply concerned that the conditions could quickly get worse. If fighting enters a city, agencies estimate it could displace another 450,000 people. The UN continues to call for an immediate end to the Marib offensive and a nationwide ceasefire.
Further, Stéphane Dujarric said that the acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs briefed the Security Council on the humanitarian situation, noting that fighting continues in nearly 50 front lines, including Marib, where at least 35,000 people have been forced to flee since September.
Also on Yemen, the acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Ramesh Rajasingham, briefed the Security Council in close consultations on the humanitarian situation. Regarding that, our colleagues are telling us that fighting is continuing along nearly 50 front lines, including in Marib, where at least 35,000 people have been forced to flee since September. Humanitarian community is scaling up assistance, but is quickly getting outpaced by the increasing scale of humanitarian needs.
The United Nations announced the allocation of $45 million to support humanitarian operations in Yemen. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said in a statement that Humanitarian Fund for Yemen has allocated $45 million to ensure the continuity of vital humanitarian services until 2022. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for UN said that aid agencies only received 55% of funding they required this year.
Yemen still needs a massive aid operation. So far, aid agencies have received about 55% of funding they require this year. This has helped to keep the famine at bay and achieve other important results, but money is quickly running out. Humanitarians also need to be able to do their work safely and without interference.
The government of the United Kingdom said that Houthis need to engage on political negotiations all at once. British Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, James Cleverly, indicated that UK achieved international agreement to impose sanctions against Houthi military leaders Mohammed al-Ghammari and Yusuf al-Madani for leading Houthi offensives throughout Yemen, particularly in Marib, and for launching cross-border attacks against Saudi Arabia. Cleverly stressed that only through political dialogue the conflict in Yemen can end. The U.S. State Department confirmed that Houthi rebels continue to detain Yemeni employees of the U.S. Embassy in Sana'a. A U.S. State Department spokeswoman called on Houthis to release the embassy staff, urging them to evacuate the building immediately and return all confiscated property. A recent study conducted by the Global Initiative concluded that Iran is involved in smuggling arms to Houthis through Somalia. More details on the findings of that study are within the following report.
Guns supplied by Iran to its Houthi allies in Yemen are being smuggled across the Gulf of Aden to Somalia by arms dealers, according to a Geneva think tank. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime said in study drew on data from more than 400 weapons documented in 13 locations across Somalia. It is the first publicly available research into the scale of illicit arms smuggling from Yemen into the Horn of Africa country. Weapons originating in the Iran-Yemen arms trade are being trafficked onward into Somalia itself, the study said. Iran has repeatedly denied any involvement in the trafficking of arms to the Houthis. However, a preponderance of evidence points to Iranian state supply. Iran's foreign ministry and a spokesman for Yemen's Houthi forces did not respond to a request for comment on the study. Iran has repeatedly denied any involvement in the trafficking of arms to its Houthi allies in Yemen, where the 6-year civil war has killed tens of thousands of Yemenis. According to the study, the investigators were not able to fully document the buyers and sellers of the weapons. While its focus was on illegal arms dealings involving Iranian-made weapons, the issue was transnational, and weapons originating in the US and other countries had also been diverted to illicit markets. The Irani involvement with Houthi rebels is quite clear and has been repeatedly expressed by top Iranian officials. Whether that involvement needs further probe in order to unveil it, it seems like confirming what is already confirmed.
Moving to Marib, where a car explosion injured a civilian in Al Wadi area. Yemen today has been informed that an explosive device was planted in the car before exploding. To the south and west of Marib, government forces backed by resistance stopped Houthi attacks. Media sources stated that Houthi militia had received great losses in lives and equipment in those battles. Previously, head of the Military Operations Authority stated that units of government forces carried out an attack on Mal'a Harib front, south of Marib, and inflicted heavy losses among the rebels. Still in Marib, the coalition in Yemen targeted a Houthi air defense system on the southern fronts. Also, the coalition announced the elimination of more than 100 Houthi militants and the destruction of 13 military vehicles in 21 air operations in Marib and Al Bayda. Turning to Sana'a, hospitals received the bodies of hundreds of Houthi militants who were killed on the fighting fronts in Marib. Medical sources confirmed to Yemen today that Sana'a hospitals have received bodies of more than 320 dead people, most of whom are senior military leaders since the beginning of this week. Despite the Houthi escalation on Marib, the government forces backed by tribes have shown great resilience in defending the rebels. Hundreds of Houthi militants have been killed during those confrontations. More on the story of Houthi losses in Marib fronts is in the following report.
Oil-rich Marib has been under a massive military attack for 2 years by the Iranian-backed terrorist militia. Houthis are imposing a stifling siege on the village in Marib and are filling populated areas with missiles. Houthis' military escalation in Marib, according to experts, will cost them thousands of lives, especially among children they are recruiting. According to Foreign Policy magazine, the victory of Houthis would mark a turning point in the conflict in Yemen, as the governorate represents one of the most important strongholds that remained under the control of the government. The government is also the center of oil in Yemen. As for the possible scenarios of war in Marib between the government forces and tribes on the one hand and the Houthis on the other, there are different scenarios. Controlling the governorate would represent control over oil fields. That means Houthis could win the war, according to the American magazine. The governorate is already living in tragic conditions because of the ongoing Houthi campaign and the successive waves of displacements. According to experts, the fall of Marib into the hands of the Houthis means controlling the sources of energy in Yemen, as well as controlling routes and lines of communication, since Marib is located in the center of Yemen. Politically, the legitimate government will lose its last stronghold. Houthi control in Marib will also mean the emergence of the Iranian power in the region, a threat to the Arabian Gulf, and control of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which international navigation and more than 6 million barrels of daily oil pass through. Picturing this scenario, major powers may be forced to secure the region, oil sources, and international navigation through direct military intervention. The other scenario is that the government forces will be able to defeat the Houthi advance. In this scenario, things will turn into a war that may also drag on until the Houthis are defeated and the Yemenis regain their country. Yet, this last scenario seems to be a painful one, but it remains the only possible one for now.
Coming next. Shabwa hosts an annual festival for the famous Yemeni honey.
لا بشيء هذا هو محل استهداف الحواث الذين استهدفوا المواطنين وهم نائمين. هذا هو الصاروخ. في الساعة 4 ما سمعنا الضربة من الحوثيين في المخيم. هذا يعني استشهدوا أولاد عمي، هذا استشهدوا يعني أخواني كلهم، يعني شوف يعني الدم في الخيم. الدم في الخيم يعني كل كان يعني رؤوسهم ما التقوش، الرأس ما التقاش، الرأس ما التقاش.
Welcome back. Over decades, Yemen has been famous for producing high-quality honey. Large quantities are exported to the region, especially Gulf countries. Shabwa is a major city known for producing honey. In fact, a festival is organized yearly in the city to show different kinds of honey. More details on this story are within the following report.
Shabwa's old city Ataq witnesses an annual festival held every November of each year to market local honey. Local honey is produced in various regions, mountains and plains of Shabwa. This market is crowded with beekeepers, sellers and honey merchants who flock to it from everywhere to trade cedar honey. Cedar honey, or al-Baghiyya, is the most popular honey in Yemen and reaches its finest in winter. Its production coincides with the ripening of cedar fruit, which is the preferred food for bees. Pure natural honey with effective health and therapeutic properties comes out of it.
بخصوص العسل فهو موسمي سنويا.
In connection with the cedar honey, it's seasonal annually during the month of November. Ataq is famous for its honey. People come to Shabwa from all neighboring governorates and attend the festival. The well-known cedar honey season extends from November to December. High-quality honey comes from Jordan, Bayhan and Harib districts. Ataq city witnesses many visitors annually during the season. But this year, the attendance has been decreased due to the deterioration of currency and high cost of living. This time, there is a gap that has become apparent in this market between supply and demand. Honey merchants attributed to the factors of collapse of national currency, high cost of living and low wages that resulted in loss of purchasing for most consumers. Reluctance of wholesalers to purchase as a result of exporting complex process to some Gulf countries, unlike previous seasons, is added to the troubles of trading honey.
بالنسبة للعرض والطلب، العرض أكثر من الطلب.
Recently, supply has become more than demand as a result of the obstacles we suffer from. such as difficulty of exporting and the economic crisis that the country is going through. We demand from the government to allocate the companies and impose taxes on honey merchants, and with this all parties benefits.
Bureaucracy of exporting local honey to Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries through imposing restrictions and conditions for its entry and marketing caused severe damage to many families in Shabwa Governorate, especially those who depend on beekeeping and selling honey. This requires more attention from the government to manage honey exporting process according to required standards, considering honey as one of the country's economic arms and a source of income on which thousands of Yemenis depends on.
Turning to Lahj, Radfan Protest Committee called for a massive demonstration from Lahj to Aden, denouncing the deteriorating living conditions. The committee called for finding solutions to the living situation, which it described as catastrophic, stressing that it intends to conduct a demonstration on Tuesday to Aden. To Aden, the central bank failed to control currency's collapse, despite new measures approved by government to help stop it. According to sources, the price of the dollar exceeded 1,500 Yemeni rial for $1 and 395 Yemeni rials for 1 Saudi rial, amid government inaction to avoid this. The war in Yemen has impacted all people, yet vulnerable women and girls have been hit badly by it. Women are not food secure. This has affected their well-being greatly. Such a thing is aggravated by the collapsing medical services. More on this story is within the following report.
Women and girls have been disproportionately affected by the war in Yemen, including by some of the worst effects of the food crisis. 1.1 million pregnant or lactating women suffered from acute malnourishment in 2018. Evidence from humanitarian crises globally shows that when food is scarce, women often sacrifice their own meals to allow their family members to eat, further increasing the risk they face. Women and children also account for roughly 75% of those displaced in Yemen. Amongst this group, female-headed households are at some of the greatest risk of food insecurity. They have lower monthly incomes, and because they have no male presence in the family, are increasingly forced to take on non-traditional roles outside the home that expose them to the risk of violence risks that have been intensified by the war. In November 2017, the UN reported that incidents of gender-based violence increased by over 63% since before the conflict. Freedom from violence is essential for women and girls to live full and healthy lives. Gender-based violence stops women and girls' immediate needs from being met and prevents them from reaching their potential. This reality is clearly illustrated in Yemen, where even women with a male in the family are increasingly cut off from the essential services. Staff from Al-Hakim, a Yemeni women's organization, told us, movement restrictions were part of women's reality, but it is now exasperated as men want to protect women from the risks of gender-based violence at checkpoints in order to preserve their honor. The desperation created by the crisis is also contributing to rising numbers of child marriages. More than 2/3 of girls are married before the age of 18, compared to 50% before the crisis began. Child marriage is often a coping mechanism for families because they believe a husband's family can offer better protection or because it can raise dowry payments to cope with conflict-related hardship. Yet, the risks of child, early or forced marriage are well established. These women and girls have children earlier and more frequently and face higher risks of pregnancy-related injuries and death in childbirth. Despite the serious and potentially life-threatening consequences of gender-based violence and poor health services access for women, these sectors suffered major funding shortfalls. As funding levels declined in September 2019, United Nations Population Fund warned over 1 million Yemeni women need funds now, or they will lose access to life-saving reproductive health services, putting their lives and those of their babies at risk.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 5 new cases of the COVID-19 in 5 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 2 cases were recorded in Lahj, 1 in Hadramaut, 1 in Al-Mahra and 1 in Shabwa. Also, 1 death was recorded plus 4 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 9,912, including 1,921 deaths and 6,616 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. The United Nations envoy Hans Grunberg confirms that the war in Yemen must end. The United Kingdom calls on all Yemeni parties to start the political talks at once. A new study by the Global Initiative confirms that Iran is involved in smuggling arms to Houthis through Somalia. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.